Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 21. A Ruined Day. The morning sun had just risen, and the doors of the Apple family farm silently opened, revealing Apple Bloom quietly stepping outside before shutting the door behind her. She glanced around for a few moments, making certain that the coast was clear, before darting through the yard, only to freeze when she heard a friendly voice come from the barn behind her. "Good morning, Apple Bloom. What are you doing up so early?" This wasn't good. Grevin was there, and if he suspected that she was about to do something that he considered dangerous, he would stop her dead in her tracks. She quickly turned while making sure her saddlebags were still clamped shut.
Oh, good morning, Grevin. I'm just heading out to the clubhouse to meet up with Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo. We've got a lot planned for today.
Grevin smiled as he set down his training equipment and crossed his arms. You do, huh? She nodded, taking a small step back.
Yep, sure do.
He said nothing for a moment before narrowing his eyes, causing the young filly's heart to race with worry. Apple Bloom?
Yes?
You're not planning on playing with fire again, are you? She blinked before letting out a breath of relief, a small laugh escaping her as she shook her head.
No way. I've had my fill of that.
He nodded in approval. Good. So, what are your plans for the day? She smiled.
We're exploring. It's going to be a lot of fun.
He blinked a moment before smirking. So I guess you did get some inspiration from that book you read yesterday.
Uh-huh. It's going to be a great day today. Well, I need to get going. See you later, Grevin.
He gave a small wave as she turned and ran off to meet her friends. Have fun, Apple Bloom. Apple Bloom let out a breath of relief as she made her way into the orchard, her mind racing, filling with ideas of what they might find when they explored the ruins in the forest. She couldn't wait to see what the others had brought along with them. She ran up the ramp to the CMC clubhouse and opened a door, revealing a tired-looking Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle sitting around a table, their saddlebags fully loaded and ready to travel.
Hey, girls. Why do you look so tired? Are you alright?
Scootaloo sighed as Sweetie Belle let her head flop down onto the table, hitting it with a resounding thunk.
AB, we aren't used to getting up this early. We don't live on a farm where you get up early all the time.
Sweetie Belle nodded with a small yawn.
Yeah, plus, we were up most of the night trying to get everything we need for today's adventure. Speaking of that, what did you bring?
Apple Bloom smiled as she opened her bags.
I brought 2 flashlights, some snacks, one of Applejack's spare ropes, and a small first aid kit. What about you?
Scootaloo opened her bags.
A flashlight, snacks, a foldable scooter, some cloth wraps in case some pony sprains an ankle.
Sweetie Belle did the same as her friends and began to list off her items.
A flashlight, snacks, a hammer, some strips of cloth that I kind of borrowed from Merity, and some bottles of water.
Apple Bloom nodded, noting that her 2 friends were now beginning to perk up.
Alright, well, we should probably get going. I know that our sisters don't want us in that forest at night, but they never said anything about going during the morning or afternoon. Not to mention that if there is trouble, we can always go to Sakura.
The 2 other fillies nodded as they closed up their bags and proceeded to follow their friend out the door and into the orchard. The destination, the castle ruins of the Everfree Forest. For a few hours the 3 traveled without much hassle, somehow avoiding timber wolves, manticores, and even the water dragon that inhabited the river that ran along the path to the castle. By now the sun was high in the sky, its light being blocked by the thick foliage of the forest trees, which casted the area in a dim, spooky atmosphere. Soon the 3 reached a large chasm that was spanned by a single, fairly worn rope and plank bridge. Sweetie Belle inched fairly close to the edge of the cliff and peeked over the side, her white coat becoming pale at the sight of the drop. She scooted back and swallowed the lump that had appeared in her throat.
Wow, that's a long way down.
Scootaloo looked over the edge as well and nodded in agreement.
Yeah. Are you too certain that the ruins are on the other side of the bridge?
Applebloom and Sweetie Belle both nodded.
Yeah, but we should be fine going across. After all, Gribbon walked across this, and I think our sisters Rainbow Dash did too. If it can hold their weight, then it can hold ours. Yeah, but that was a while ago. What's the matter? Turning into a chicken again? I am not a chicken!
Scootaloo fumed in an act of anger. She moved forward to the bridge and began to walk across, not caring for her safety at the moment.
I'll prove it to you too. Just watch. I'll be the first one across.
Sweetie Belle, not to be outdone quickly, moved behind her friend, while Applebloom looked at the bridge with a hint of concern in her eyes. After a few moments, she noticed that her friends were more than halfway across, so she stepped onto the bridge, pausing a few seconds when she heard it groan under her weight. Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle both reached the other side of the bridge with ease, and turned to wait for their friend, who was taking very careful steps. When Applebloom was nearly 3/4 of the way across, Sweetie Belle grew impatient and stomped her hoof down.
Come on, Applebloom. The castle's really close. I know. I just want to be careful. I don't want to...
The bridge popped and creaked as it began to shift under her weight. Applebloom stopped her movement and looked at her friends with terror in her eyes.
Fall.
The bridge suddenly snapped away from its supports where the girls had been moments before. Applebloom screamed as she latched onto a plank as the bridge swung out from under her, pulling her with it. Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle could only watch in horror as their friend swung down past the cliff edge and slammed into the side of the cliff, hanging onto a portion of the bridge for dear life.
Oh no, Applebloom!
Applebloom groaned as she tried to gather her senses. She could feel gravity's pull on her as she hung onto the plank. Tears came to her eyes as she realized she could fall and never be seen again.
Scootaloo! Sweetie Belle, help! I don't want to fall.
Sweetie Belle paced nervously as she tried to think of a way to help her friend. She couldn't run back to Ponyville to get Rainbow Dash or Fluttershy, nor could she get to Sakura in time. Things were looking bad. Scootaloo, however, had her sports training with Rainbow Dash to help her. She paused for only a second before an idea hit her.
Applebloom, can you get the rope in your saddlebag?
Applebloom whimpered but nodded as she hung onto the bridge with her left hoof and began searching through her pack with her right.
I think so. Got it.
She pulled out the long rope and quickly wrapped her arm back around the plank, putting less pressure on her left leg.
You need to wrap it around yourself and toss up the rest of it to us. We'll pull you up.
She quickly did as she was told, but hesitated when she went to throw the rope above her head.
Do you think this will work? Will you be able to pull me up? Yes, don't worry. We won't let anything happen to a fellow crusader. Now come on, throw the rope.
Applebloom clenched her eyes shut and swung her arm back before launching the bundle of rope into the air above her head with as much effort as she could muster. Scootaloo saw the rope coming, but much to her horror, it was going wide, away from the cliff. She wouldn't be able to catch it. Sweetie Belle didn't hesitate. She launched herself forward, doing her best to keep at least one hoof on the edge while she reached for the rope. Time seemed to slow down as she moved closer to her target, her hooves reaching out to grab it. Unfortunately, she missed and the rope began to slide through her grip, so she did the only thing she could think of. She leaned forward the rest of the way and clamped down on the rope with her teeth, holding it tight, even as she began to tumble off the edge. Sweetie Belle almost screamed as she began to fall, only to be jarred to a stop as a painful sensation filled her being, especially her tail. She looked over her shoulder to see Scootaloo smiling back at her, with a mouthful of her tail. Slowly, Scootaloo began to pull her friend, grunting in effort, and the moment they both were on solid ground, they began to pull Applebloom. After a few moments, the three were all laying on the ground, breathing hard and doused with sweat. Applebloom took a shaky breath and raised her hoof.
I say, we take a 10-minute break. All in favor?
Aye. 10 minutes later, the three fillies, now rested up, hopped back on their feet, ready to continue their journey. Scootaloo, however, looked over to Sweetie Belle, a questioning look in her eyes.
Hey, Sweetie Belle. Yeah? Why did you jump off the cliff like that to get the rope?
Sweetie grinned as she began to lead the group towards the castle in the distance.
Because I knew my fellow Cutie Mark Crusaders would catch me. Come on, let's go. The castle is in sight. We're almost there.
The other two fillies ran after their friend, and within minutes they found themselves coming to the steps that would lead them into the large, imposing structure. The three couldn't help but feel minuscule when compared to its size. Each filly let out a small gulp of fear before slowly making their way up the steps and into the structure through a set of heavy wooden doors. What greeted them inside was nothing more than empty hallways, cobwebs, and dust. The three got out their flashlights, flipping them on, bathing the shadows in light. Sweetie Belle looked around a few moments before frowning.
I don't get it. This isn't anything like the book. Where are the traps? Where are the ancient tapestries and symbols?
Applebloom nodded as she moved further down the stone hallway.
I know. Maybe it's all further inside?
Scootaloo shook her head.
I don't know, girls. Maybe we should leave?
Sweetie Belle shook her head as she began to turn down another corridor.
No way. We just got here. Let's keep looking. Maybe we'll find something.
Applebloom and Scootaloo shared a nervous glance before running after their friend, not wishing to be left behind. Soon, several minutes of exploring had become nearly an hour and a half, with nothing still being found. They had managed to explore several corridors and rooms, but only found empty vases and broken statues. They had made their way into a large chamber that once again held nothing, and finally, Sweetie Belle began to run out of energy. She sighed and sat down, nearly collapsing as she did so.
I don't get it. There isn't anything here. What are we doing wrong?
Scootaloo shrugged her shoulders as she sat down next to her friend.
I don't think so. Maybe there isn't anything here.
Their conversation was interrupted by a loud banging sound that echoed through the halls, sending a chill down the three fillies' spines. They all slowly turned to where the sound came from, while at the same time beginning to huddle closer together. Applebloom decided to be a bit brave and took a hesitant step forward.
Maybe there is something here. We should investigate. How else are we gonna get our cutie marks?
Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo joined their friend, each nodding in agreement. They paused as they heard more noises, including the sound of metal striking metal and the shuffling of feet. After a few moments, the sound faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The three fillies glanced at one another again, before stepping forward once more. Within moments they found themselves in a vast chamber filled with large glass windows and tall concrete pillars. The room was in a state of degradation. A large pile of rubble lay in the center of the room, and if the fillies looked close enough, they would be able to see a pool of dried blood on the ground. Applebloom slowed to a stop and looked around carefully as her friend stood beside her.
What is this room? I don't know. It looks humongous. Maybe it was a throne room?
Scootaloo shook her head.
I don't know, but
She pointed a hoof out at the pool of dried blood in the rubble nearby.
it looks like something bad happened here at some point. Look at all that blood.
Sweetie Belle shivered at the sight and took a step back.
That looks awful.
Apple Bloom nodded.
Yeah, I don't think we should stick around.
Scootaloo raised a hoof and paused a moment as she took a closer look at the blood on the floor.
Wait a second, girls. I think I remember hearing about this room.
Sweetie Belle tilted her head to the side, her curiosity showing now.
You do? What do you remember? Could this be where Ayy's sister, Rainbow Dash, and the others met Grevin?
Apple Bloom paused before jumping in excitement.
I remember now. It is the room they met him. This must be where Fluttershy was hurt and he helped her.
She trotted over to the rubble and put a hoof on a small portion of the stone pillar near the bloodstain, attempting to push it with a little grunt.
Wow, this is really heavy.
Scootaloo trotted over and pushed on it as well.
Was this part of the rubble that had trapped Fluttershy? Did Grevin move this to get to her?
Sweetie Belle nodded as she moved to the pool of dried blood.
I think so. And I think this is where Fluttershy was trapped. I remember hearing about how he used magic to heal her, just like he healed you, Apple Bloom.
Apple Bloom smiled as she looked further around the room.
It's an amazing power he has. I think Grevin is like a superhero, just like Ne'er-do-well.
Scootaloo shook her head.
No way. He never claimed to be a hero. He is pretty cool, though Rainbow Dash is way more awesome.
Sweetie Belle rolled her eyes as she walked past her friend.
Come on, let's explore the room and see if we can find something. Don't forget, girls, we're on a mission here.
The three fillies began to move around the room, looking at every corner, nook, and cranny they could find while making a small talk as they went. After 15 minutes, the three had begun to tire and settled on the pile of rubble, ready to take part in a portion of their snacks, when they were interrupted by the ominous sound of a dark, deep chuckle filling the air, echoing around them. The three fillies gasped as they immediately broke into a run, moving for the room entrance, but were forced to a stop by a deep, menacing voice sounding before them in the hall.
Well. Where do you think you're going? You're not leaving yet, are you? You can't. I've only just met you, and I want to have some fun before I leave. Not to mention, I have so many questions for you.
The girls whimpered as they backed away, cowering as their eyes widened in terror, a cold sweat forming on their coats as an imposing figure slowly moved out of the darkness, towering over them, its shadow slowly enveloping the three.
Now tell me more about this Grevin I've heard you talk so much about.
Grevin stretched a bit as he put away the rest of his training equipment in the barn, deciding to once again leave his armor off and walk around in a simple t-shirt and pants. He paused a moment when he realized that he never felt so relaxed in a place he felt comfortable leaving his cloak and armor behind before. It was a pleasant, though slightly unsettling feeling. He shrugged it off and quickly made his way down the steps and out of the barn, heading to the farmhouse. Much to his surprise, he found that Big Mac's tools were once again left untouched. It was as though the large stallion wasn't around at all. Perhaps he was sick, though he couldn't imagine one as hardy as Big Mac getting sick. He quietly stepped up onto the farmhouse porch and knocked on the door, expecting to hear Granny Smith to tell him to come inside. Instead, he was greeted by the voice of Applejack, who didn't sound like she was in a good mood at all.
Come in.
Grevin hesitated to enter. his hand resting on the door handle as he replayed the events of the other day in his mind. He didn't know what he had done to upset her, but he knew that perhaps he should apologize to her and try to get things back to normal. He pulled back on the screen door and stepped into the warm building, clearing his throat to announce his presence. The smell of cinnamon oatmeal wafted through the air, followed by the sound of some dishes clinking together. He made his way into the kitchen, letting himself rest against the door frame while he watched Applejack move around the kitchen, pouring the oatmeal into 3 bowls, her back turned to him. After a few moments of silence, he decided he needed to say something, so he took a small breath and cleared his throat once more.
Good morning, Applejack.
She glanced over her shoulder at him, a small frown on her lips as her tail flicked ever so slightly. Granted. He sighed a bit and slowly stepped into the room, pulling out a chair from the table and sitting down smoothly.
It looks like it's going to be a beautiful day today.
She nodded as she set the pot of oatmeal to the side, taking one in her hoof, moving to the table. She kept her eyes off his, never making contact, instead choosing to look at the floor and table. Yep, sure is. He frowned a bit as she skipped any further conversation and began to eat from her bowl, her focus still avoiding him. He got up and picked up his own bowl of oatmeal and took a few bites before setting it down in the sink. He had pretty much given up on having any sort of conversation with her, but stopped as he was about to leave the room, glancing over his shoulder for a few seconds. He took a steadying breath, letting his hand clench at his side ever so slightly.
Okay, look. I know you're upset with me, Applejack, and I want you to know that I am sorry. I don't know exactly what I did to upset you, but I know it wasn't intentional. I'm still relatively new to Equestria, and I don't know all the social expectations and norms. So if I've done something awful, I apologize.
He took a few steps forward, pausing for only a moment.
I'll try to get some chores done when I get back from town. I have to do some more looking into the spectral nights and the elements of valor. I hope you have a good day today. I'll see you later.
He turned, moving out the doorway, and out the door to the porch. Applejack simply sat in the kitchen, staring at where the man had been standing, a small frown on her lips, her eyes showing hurt and worry. She slowly pulled back from the table and let out a small sigh as she moved on to her herbs. She looked out the window, watching him walk out toward town, and in a soft voice she spoke. You too, Sugar Cube. You too. Applejack waited for Grevin to walk out of sight before turning away from the window, her eyes downcast, ears drooped, and a sad frown on her lips. She felt badly for Grevin, especially since he didn't deserve her anger from the night before, but at the same time, she was frustrated with her friends and her behavior. She began to clean up the dishes and let her mind focus on her predicament. Fluttershy and Twilight were both beginning to become more aggressive with Grevin, and while they had managed to give him a kiss, she couldn't even muster up the courage to tell him how she truly felt, let alone what she had thought about doing with him. She slammed a hoof down in the sink, growling as she shook her head, pushing a growing blush back from her cheeks. She didn't need to let herself get into any sort of daydream about him. At least not yet. There was still work that needed to be done. Still, as she began to put the clean dishes away, she couldn't help but think that perhaps she should throw caution to the wind and meet him in his loft late one night. She felt her cheeks redden as her mind began to run with the idea, even as she made her way up the stairs to wake up Applebloom. She ran the scenario through her mind with each hoofstep. She could sneak into the loft and wait for him to return from the orchard. She would be lying on her side on his makeshift bed, and as he would walk in, she would sit up ever so slowly, while smiling at him. He would question her as to why she would be there, and she would dodge the question by getting up and sauntering over to him. He would back up, of course, and she would use that to her advantage, by backing him against a wall, trapping him. She would rise up on her back hooves and slide her front hooves across his chest, taking in the scent of his sweat from the day's work. She would lean in and nuzzle his neck, taking a deep whiff of his scent before lightly nipping at his neck, and before he could question her further, she would press her lips to his in a deep, heated kiss that would convey to him just how she felt. Applejack shook her head and giggled at the thought of acting that way. That would seem more like something Rarity would try. She could always sneak into the loft after everyone had gone to sleep. She would carefully move into the loft and watch him from a distance for a few moments before making her way over to where he lay. She would move over his sleeping form and slowly begin to kiss her way up to his collar, to his neck and chin, enjoying his scent as she did so. She would let her tail brush against his sides, and then she would kiss him, softly at first, and then with more fervor as he woke. He would of course wake up startled and push her away, asking what she was doing there, but she would just respond with a wink and lean in once more to capture his lips with hers. That should convey her intent quite well. She shook her head once more to clear her thoughts as she began to feel a familiar, tingling sensation between her thighs, and once again steel herself against her wild imagination. After all, there would be time for that after she gets Applebloom her breakfast and finished her chores. Applejack knocked on Applebloom's door, only to have it swing open the moment she touched it. She stuck her head in the room, expecting to see her sister sleeping soundly, but much to her surprise, not only was she not there, but the bed was made and the room was relatively clean.
Applebloom, where did you get to?
She didn't recall hearing the filly leave the house, but then again she was focused more on the man occupying her mind than her surroundings.
Well, maybe she went to go to the clubhouse. That filly needs to remember her responsibilities before she goes off crusadering.
Applejack quickly made her way downstairs and out the door, turning to head into the orchard. The trees looked quite beautiful at this time of morning, and she couldn't help but smile as she took a slow, deep breath. She felt a small wave of relaxation flow through her. She was home. Sure, those little spa trips that Rarity took her on from time to time were nice, and a party with Pinkie Pie was fun, but she never felt as peaceful at one of those things as she did when she was in the orchard. She wondered if Grevin felt that way as well. It would certainly explain why he would come out here to train rather than in an open field. She would have to ask him at some point. Applejack slowed her pace as the CMC clubhouse came into view, and much to her chagrin, it appeared to be empty. She made her way up the ramp and opened the door to find that indeed she was right about that, and a small seed of worry began to sprout in her stomach.
Applebloom, you know better than to take off without telling us where you're going. Where are you?
Applejack sat and thought for a few moments, in an attempt to figure out where her sister could be, when an idea hit her. She knew that Sweetie Belle was a crusader as well, so perhaps Applebloom went to Rarity's home to meet her there. That would certainly make sense.
When I get my hands on that filly, I'm going to give her a strong reminder as to why she would always tell me where she's going.
Applejack broke into a light run, heading toward Ponyville, a small part of her mind hoping that she wouldn't run into Grevin, at least for a little while. It was bad enough that she had made him feel bad, but she didn't want to trouble him with this as well. On top of that, she also hoped that she wouldn't be bothered by too many mares, who were now curious about the mysterious warrior who saved Canterlot. Stupid horses, who simply wanted to try and get him as some sort of status symbol. Of course, as she ran into Ponyville, Applejack heard several call out to her, asking questions left and right.
Hey, Applejack, does Grevin like wubs? Does he like to party?
Vinyl, leave the poor man alone. Perhaps I'm sure he would prefer symphony and a classy dinner.
Hey, if you like him that much, maybe he would come and party with the both of us.
What, Vinyl?
Oh, hey, Applejack, does Grevin like hot air balloon rides? Applejack, do you know if Grevin would like some fresh cut flowers for his room? Do you know if he likes to do drinks at bars?
Applejack rolled her eyes at the various mares calling out to her, ignoring their questions and instead focusing her attention on trying to get to the carousel boutique before Rarity became too engrossed in her work. Soon enough, her destination came into view, and she quickly burst through the door, startling the white unicorn inside, causing her to drop several rolls of fabric to the ground.
Rarity! What? Oh, Applejack, dear, please don't bust in like that. You give me quite the fright.
She turned and began to clean up the mess she had made.
What can I do for you? Perhaps you need a new dress to entice a certain some pony?
Rarity teased, which only caused Applejack to face her.
Will you knock that off? I'm here looking for Apple Bloom. She isn't at home, and I thought she might have come here to visit Sweetie Belle.
Rarity shook her head lightly as she levitated the glasses she was wearing to a nearby table.
Well, I haven't seen her, darling. Perhaps she is with Sweetie Belle upstairs.
She turned and made her way over to the nearby staircase.
Sweetie Belle! Sweetie, are you up? Is Apple Bloom up there with you? Her sister is looking for her.
The two waited for a few moments, hearing nothing from the second floor. Rarity glanced back at Applejack and gave a slight shrug before turning and making her way upstairs, the orange farm pony close behind.
Sweetie Belle?
Rarity led the way to the filly's room where the door was shut. She quickly opened the door, and much to her surprise, she found that the room was empty. The bed was messy, and there were various bits of cloth strewn about the room. Rarity's jaw dropped, and she gasped as she ran in and began to look around.
Oh, my stars, this is horrible!
Applejack gasped and quickly joined her friend, looking around.
What is it?
Rarity groaned. She picked up a few shreds of cloth.
I was saving this fabric for a new design I wanted to try today.
Applejack rolled her eyes.
Rarity, do you know where they are, or don't you?
Rarity quickly dropped a cloth, her mind focusing on the more important task now.
No, I don't. This isn't good. Sweetie knows better than to take off without telling any pony where she is going. What if something bad has happened? Applejack, what do we do?
Applejack sighed as she felt concern in her stomach grow tenfold.
We need to find Twilight and Grevin. Come on, let's get a move on.
As Grevin made his way into town, he couldn't help but notice that there was a lack of stallions in the street that day. He knew that the stallion-to-mare ratio that was fairly low in Equestria, but at the moment it seemed like stallions didn't exist at all. He couldn't help but wonder if it was related to how Big Mac had disappeared too. He knew one thing though. He didn't like how the mares in the village had begun to watch him as he walked from street to street. He could feel their eyes on him, watching from just a passing glance to a full-out stare. It reminded him of how people would stare at him in Bastion, and made him yearn for his cloak. He noticed that as he made his way past the park, Lyra, the mare that seemed to freak out at his very existence, and Bonbon, her friend, were watching him closely from the park bench they sat on. It was almost as though they were sizing him up for a fight. He didn't like it. Things didn't improve the further he went into town. As he made his way through the market, he noticed that once again there were no stallions, not even in the vendor stalls. He watched several mares glance at him, some clearly letting their eyes wander a bit, the look in their eyes sending a small shiver down his back. He could have sworn that he even saw some lick their lips, like he was a piece of meat. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel like he was being followed, and once he began to focus on his surroundings, he did indeed hear the sound of hoofsteps on earth behind him. By now his imagination had begun to get the better of him, and he felt the need to quicken his pace. Gradually he began to take faster and faster steps, moving through a few alleyways to avoid the main streets when he could, but the sound behind him did not cease. If anything, it increased in pace. Now he felt the urge to run, to escape and hide until he could calm himself. But as he put his foot down in an effort to break into a jog, a soft mass slammed into his back, knocking him to the ground into an uncontrolled roll. Eventually the two lost momentum, and Grevin ended up on his back, groaning as he looked up at whoever it was that had tackled him.
Hiya, Grevy! How are you today?
Grevin blinked as he looked up at the bright smiling face of Pinkie Pie. She sat comfortably on his chest and was staring down at him with large blue, innocent eyes.
Oh, Pinkie Pie.
She grinned and nodded.
Yep, that's my name. Glad you remembered it. Not that I would expect you to forget it either, though if you did forget it, I'm glad you remembered, otherwise this would be really awkward.
He blinked a moment as he began to sit up, and she moved to sit next to him.
Yeah, so why did you tackle me?
She giggled.
Because I was trying to catch you. You were walking really, really fast.
He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, while taking a moment to look around. He could tell that they were totally alone, the alleyway empty with the exception of them and a few trash cans.
Yeah, I thought I was running late. So, what did you need?
She jumped in place for a moment before frowning ever so slightly, while looking at him.
Well, I noticed that you seem to have a bit of a dark cloud over your head today, so I thought about what could be bothering you. Maybe you miss your old home, maybe you were lonely, maybe you need a mare friend, maybe a cult friend. Oh, maybe you were approached by several mares that don't want to upset anyone while trying to work out through your own personal scars and demons. Or maybe you just had some indigestion.
She grinned as his jaw dropped, his words now failing him. How did she know? Did she know? How was that possible? Before he could ask her, she continued.
So, anyway, I thought to myself, Gordon looks down. What can I do to help him? And then it hit me.
She leaned in lightly and hugged his shoulder.
You just need a visit from your good friend Pinkie Pie. I'll turn that frown upside down.
Griffin had to admit that her bubbly nature, combined with the warmth of the hug she was giving him, was enough to make a small smirk come to his lips. But he didn't feel too comfortable when she held the hug for more than a few seconds, and began to pull back, especially when images from last night's nightmare began to play through his mind.
I appreciate it, Pinkie, but I'm alright.
She blinked and took a small step back, a look of concern showing on her face for an instant.
Are you sure? I mean, I know all kinds of ways to help cheer you up. We could play a board game, or we could go swimming. Ooh, we could make out, or we could go get some ice cream sundaes. We could go feed the fish in the lake, or we could go for a boat ride.
She turned and began to walk around him now, tail flicking from time to time as she continued to list various activities, much to his amazement and shock. Grevin quickly rose to his feet, his mind reeling as he tried to identify if he heard what he thought he heard, but shook his head, deciding not to press the issue. Pinkie Pie, however, seemed to be far from finished.
Ooh, we could have a herd party, or we could call up DJ Palm 3 and have a real dance party. Or maybe Octavia if you prefer slower stuff. We could bake some cupcakes or read a book. Maybe we could go skiing or skydiving. Even join the Mile High Club. While we're at it, ooh, what if we played a few pranks on some ponies?
The mile... what now?
Maybe you'd like to go partying in a bar. I know some awesome ones you'd love, though maybe we have to be careful because some ponies in those places tend to get a little grabby. But if you like that kind of thing, then it's all good.
Oh dear, why isn't she stopping?
Pinkie?
Oh, if you do like that sort of thing, I know a perfect place to go. They would love to have you there too, especially since all stallions in town have disappeared. They have this thing called a glory.
Pinkie, that's enough. It's okay.
Griffin firmly planted a hand on the pink bear's shoulder, interrupting her thoughts, while she seemed to be taking things all in stride. He was beginning to sport some very red cheeks and a nervous sweat. Pinkie turned her head and smiled up at the man, acting as though she didn't talk for several minutes without seeming to take a breath.
Oh, okay. So, are you sure you don't need some cheering up? Do you want to talk?
He hesitated now and took a small step back, before rising to his full height, attempting to keep his blush from growing worse. I wouldn't want to trouble you, Pinkie. She shook her head as she reared up and placed a hoof on his chest, her eyes locking onto his with deathly seriousness.
Don't you ever think you're troubling me, mister? I'm your friend, and friends listen to one another.
She hopped back down and brightly smiled up at him, while tilting her head to the side.
So, Spill, what's bothering you?
He glanced away before looking back at her.
Promise not to judge me, get angry with me, hit me, or tell any pony this.
She smirked and went into her familiar little phrase.
Cross my heart or hope to fly, stick a cupcake in my eye.
He nodded and sighed, visibly relaxing.
Somehow I've managed to get a few mares interested in me, some of which have gone so far as to kiss me. When I told another mare what happened, she asked me if I liked it, and I would have been lying if I said I didn't. I mean, it felt nice. A little awkward, but nice.
Pinkie Pie grinned and nodded.
I know, right?
He blinked a moment in confusion before continuing.
Well, anyway, when I answered the mare honestly, her entire mood shifted and she smacked me across the face. Now she won't speak more than a few words to me. Honestly, I don't know what to do. I've had very bad experiences with this sort of thing in the past, and I don't want to be hurt again. At the same time, I don't want to hurt any pony, and on top of that, I don't know if it would even work between me and a pony. He sighed and crossed his arms, looking down at his feet. I don't know. Does this make any sense to you? Pinkie raised her hoof to her chin for a moment of thought before nodding.
Yep, it sure does. It sounds like you have more mares after you than you think. It also sounds like they might be getting jealous of one another's actions with you. I think you should give them all a chance, but I know you may have had a rough time in the past, but I don't think you're broken.
He blinked at her words and looked over at her.
You think so?
She smiled and rose up onto her rear hooves, once more placing a steadying hoof on his arms and chest.
I know it. I also know that many mares would love to get to know you. After all, you saved Canterlot. You're awesome. You're super nice and humble, but you can kick butt when you have to. You think of your others and not yourself and put the greater good over your own needs. Want to know something funny?
He blinked as she leaned in, whispering ever so quietly.
Well, sure.
He nodded, his curiosity piqued. She smirked and placed a hoof by her mouth, turning to whisper in his ear.
Some mares have started a betting pool about you. They're betting whether you're a good kisser or not.
He paused, his breath hitching in his throat as he heard her words, a simple thought passing through his mind. How the hell are they going to judge that?
What do you mean?
Pinkie wrapped her hooves around his neck as she pushed her lips against his, hard, causing his eyes to snap open in shock. Grevin tried to pull back, but the pink mare only pressed in closer, letting her soft body press against his, as she parted her lips and began to let her tongue dart against his, in an attempt to gain entry. Grevin tried to resist by shaking his mouth and grunting out a sound of complaint, but the instant he relaxed his lips, Pinkie's tongue darted into his mouth and began to wrestle with his for dominance. The only thought that came to his mind at that moment was that she had been chewing bubblegum at some point. Grevin moved his hands to her barrel in an attempt to push her away, but she quickly pressed closer, moaning softly as her tail flicked back and forth. After a few seconds, Pinkie Pie broke the kiss and backed her face away from his, looking into his eyes with her half-lidded ones. She smirked and winked at him as he tried to make sense as to what had just happened.
You okay, Grevy?
He took a quick breath and cleared his throat.
Pinkie, what the hell was that about?
She giggled as she backed away once again, returning to all four hooves.
Silly Grevy, I was asked to be the judge for the betting pool. How else was I going to get you to see if you were a good kisser or not?
He blinked a few moments as she laughed before shaking his head.
So, So that wasn't you having feelings for me? She stopped and looked up at him with wide eyes.
Oh, no, no, you don't think that, No, I'm sorry, Grevin. You're a great guy, you really are. You're even pretty hot, but I'm more of a FWB kind of mare. Maybe someday I'll settle down, and then you can have me all to yourself.
He quickly shook his head, waving his hand in front of his chest. Oh, no, that wasn't what I meant. Pinkie, though, had already turned and was making her way out of the alleyway, ignoring his words. She paused, however, just before stepping back onto the street, and looked back at him from over her shoulder, sending a wink in his direction.
Don't worry, Grevin. I won't tell my friends about how you feel about me. Also consider what I said and give them a chance. Ask some pony out on a date sometime. Just be careful during the season. Also, just so you know, you kiss really well for someone who's never gone all the way before.
With that, she flicked her tail and gave a bright smile and stepped away, leaving the confused and blushing man alone. How the hell? What the fuck? What just happened? He asked no one in particular. He scratched the back of his neck and adjusted his shirt as he tried to make sense of his interaction with Pinkie Pie. Well, she had just thrown him for a loop with that kiss. Her reasoning did seem to make sense. For her, anyways. As for her advice, well, she was right. Maybe he should consider asking out some pony. Twilight or Fluttershy, perhaps? One question bothered him, though. How did Pinkie Pie know he hadn't taken the full plunge, so to speak? Was it glaringly obvious? He sighed and shook his head, deciding to just leave it alone and move on. He smoothed his hair once more before making his way back out onto the street, continuing on his path to Twilight's house. He did his best to avoid running into any ponies, especially those that seemed to be watching him intently. He didn't know what was going on, but something just didn't feel right in town that day. He even ignored the mares that would wave hello at him, simply waving his hand before walking faster, and tried to pull his attention to them by calling his name. Eventually he did make it to Twilight's home, and knocked on the door. Within moments it opened, and he heard her cheery voice inside, beckon him to come in. Grevin quietly entered and closed the door behind him, before turning to look for Twilight, who wasn't in the main library at the moment. Twilight, where are you?
I'm in the kitchen.
He heard the sound of a plate being set in the sink before she made her way out of the small doorway and into the main room.
Sorry about that. I was getting hungry, and a daisy sandwich just sounded great.
No problem. I'm sorry it took me so long to come by. It's been quite a morning. She smiled and nodded before moving past him towards the large table where more ancient texts lay open, turned to various pages.
I understand. Well, before we go to the castle ruins, I thought you'd like to know I finally found some mention of a spectral knight in an ancient volume of equestrian children's stories.
He blinked and chuckled a bit as he crossed his arms and made his way over to join her. Children's stories? The kind of tall tales and myths that are told to put young ones to sleep? You've got to be kidding me. She shook her head as she looked up at him.
No, I'm not known for my jokes. That's more Pinkie Pie's area. It gives a small description of a knight that is fighting a monster.
She began to glance through several lines of text before stopping with a smile.
Ah, here it is. The monster was strong and swift, and all hope seemed lost until a very special knight seemed to fall from the heavens. The knight was bathed in bright light, and wore shining armor from head to hoof. He wielded a powerful weapon, and knew exactly how to fight the evil he faced. He also had a pair of large, powerful wings.
So, if I understand this right, the knight was a Pegasus pony, which would explain the falling from the heavens thing, which wore special armor and wielded a specialized weapon of some sort, most likely from his element of valor. Twilight nodded.
Right, but there is more. It says that the knight was able to fend off the darkness with a special gem in his armor. I'm guessing that was the element. It also states that after the evil was vanquished, the knight only disappeared only to return in times of great need.
Grevin raised a hand to his chin as he paced back and forth for a few moments. Okay, I'm going to assume that this means the knight would remain hidden as a commoner in order to protect his loved ones from harm. It makes the most sense. He would be able to keep tabs on the state of the land, while still being able to live a normal life. As for the gem, I'm guessing that it is somehow integrated into his armor.
Twilight nodded, but a small frown adorned her lips. That's what I was guessing as well, but I just wish I could find some more information. Right now, all we have is based on speculation. We could be completely wrong. Honestly, the element of valor could be a complete myth, and this story could be some simple tall tale to tell fools to keep them at sleep at night.
Grevin sighed a bit and ran a hand through his hair. Well, I think that the only possible solution is to do some more hands-on investigating.
Twilight smirked and nodded as she closed the book and moved around to the front of the table, her eyes never leaving his. I agree. We should go back to the castle and see what we can find, though I'm more prepared for that now.
He blinked and raised an eyebrow at the lavender mare. What do you mean by more prepared?
She smiled and flitted over her saddlebag, opening it with her magic. Well, I packed flashlights, flares, matches, trail mix, a first aid kit, a blanket that I shrank down with my magic for easier storage, a tent that I shrank as well.
Grevin waved his hands in front of him as he shook his head. Wait, did you just say a tent? Why would we need a tent? She blinked, looking at her saddlebag, then up at him, as a sheepish smile came to her face.
Well, in case we are there late into the evening and we need to get some sleep, I figured we could share a single tent without hassle, though it may require some fairly close quarters.
Grevin frowned and turned away, rolling his eyes as he did so. Twilight, don't you think that would be a bit inappropriate? She shook her head as she floated her bags onto her back.
No, not at all. I'm comfortable with myself enough that I can share space with any pony. Aren't you?
He sighed and nodded. I am. I've had to share tents in Bastion many times, but I think this circumstance is a little bit different, don't you? Twilight blushed a bit and glanced to the side as she lightly ran a hoof in circles in front of her.
Well, no, not really. Should it be?
Grevin frowned and looked down at his feet a moment. I suppose not, though I think I'll just use a nearby tree to sleep in if it comes to that. I wouldn't wish to keep you awake with my snoring.
Twilight giggled and nodded. All right, fair enough.
Say, Twilight, I have a bit of a question regarding something I've been noticing around Ponyville as of late. She tilted her head to the side, blinking as she did so.
What is it, Grevin?
Well, lately I've noticed that many stallions in town are missing. On top of that, when I walk through town, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. A lot. Then on top of that, Pinkie Pie out and out kissed me today, saying it was some sort of betting pool. Do you know what's going on? Twilight blinked a moment before she frowned and grit her teeth, while turning to look away from him. How dare those other mares start to eye the one she wants? It was bad enough with Fluttershy, Applejack, and even Princess Luna wanting him. But now there were others? She forced her anger aside and cleared her throat.
Well, you see, ever since you helped to fight that dragon in Canterlot, you've become pretty famous. Ponies know you, and the strength you have, plus the reputation you carry makes you desirable. So it's only natural for some mares to be checking you out as you walk around. I'm sure people in Bastion would do the same thing, right?
He nodded. Well, yes, but it didn't cause people to feel as uncomfortable as this made me. I almost felt like a piece of meat being made ready to eat.
Twilight sighed and sat on her rump. Well, the truth is that every once in a while, mares begin to
Twilight jumped when the front door shuddered under the heavy strikes of someone outside.
Come in.
The door flew open, and an extremely worried Rarity and Applejack both ran in, their eyes wide with concern. Twilight rose up and ran to her friends, Grevin close behind her.
Grevin, have you seen Applebloom, Sweetie Belle, and Scootaloo?
Applejack quickly glanced between the two, the worry on her face evident. Twilight quickly shook her head.
No, I haven't.
Grevin nodded. I saw Applebloom this morning, just before I came in for breakfast. She said she was meeting the girls at the clubhouse. Is everything all right?
Rarity shook her head. Not at all, darling. Sweetie and the girls seem to have disappeared. They aren't at the clubhouse, and we can't seem to find them at all.
Applejack stamped a hoof down.
I just know they're out there doing some silly stunt trying to get their cutie marks. Those three always seem to find trouble.
Twilight raised a hoof to her chin and thought for a moment before gasping and quickly turning on her hooves to run back into the library.
I have an idea. The girls came here yesterday to try and find a book that would help inspire them to find ways to earn their cutie marks. I gave them a book thinking that they would enjoy it and forget about their mission for a little while. Oh, where did I put it? Ah, here it is.
She quickly returned with the book in tow.
I gave them this book to read yesterday. I didn't think they would find anything troublesome in it.
Grevin quickly took the book from her magical field and turned it over and read the title. Daring Do in the Ruins of Peril. His voice trailed off as he let his arm drop, his mind taking him back to the conversation with Discord. 2 gifts. Ponies become lost. A place where threats abound. Ruins. Oh shit. Grevin dropped the book and turned to the purple librarian before it could hit the floor. Twilight, I think I know where they are, and there isn't a moment to waste. Rarity reared up and placed a hoof on his arm.
Then tell us where you think they are, Grevin. Quickly now.
Grevin backed up, letting the mare fall back to her hooves. I think they went to the castle ruins in the Everfree Forest, where we all first met. If I'm right, they could be in some serious danger.
Applejack frowned. It's the same place where we found the elements of harmony, and where we faced down Nightmare Moon. We need to get out there right now. It's not safe.
She turned to run out the door.
Come on, every pony. We need to hurry up.
No. Grevin spoke quietly as the 3 mares bolted for the door. Applejack skidded to a halt and looked over her shoulder, narrowing her eyes.
What do you mean, no? Applebloom and the others could be in deep trouble. Are you going to come and protect him?
Grevin let out a small growl from his throat as he took several quick steps to the door. You 3 go ahead without me. Twilight frowned.
Grevin, what if we need you?
He glanced over his shoulder before stepping past Applejack and moving through the doorway. I'll be there soon, but I have to get something first. Don't worry, I'll hurry. Now go, quickly. The 3 mares stood quietly for a moment as they watched the man break into a full run, heading straight for Sweet Apple Acres, a small trail of dust wafting in the air in his wake. Twilight sighed a moment before being shaken by Rarity.
Twilight, darling, we must hurry. Let's go save those 3 fillies.
Twilight nodded, her eyes narrowing.
All right, I'm going to try something. Brace yourselves.
She closed her eyes and grit her teeth, and within a few moments a bright glow began to emit from her horn, bathing the library in its light. The glow intensified and even began to make a soft humming sound as the glowing orb of magical energy began to form at the tip of her horn, growing in size with each passing second. Within a few seconds the orb burst, bathing the mares in a blinding flash of light, and, as it faded, the 3 had disappeared. Seconds later, the 3 found themselves in the outer edges of the Everfree Forest, their eyes and heads and stomachs recovering from the spell. Applejack held a hoof to her mouth as her eyes rolled about.
Next time you do that, give me some warning, would you?
Rarity groaned as she held a hoof to her head, her eyes clenched shut as she tried to ignore the headache she now had.
Indeed, dear.
A little forewarning would be appreciated. Twilight rolled her eyes and pointed to the path they had taken once before, those many years ago.
You two can get mad at me later. We need to find those fillies. Let's go.
The two other mares nodded as determination washed across their faces. From that moment on, they put aside their individual concerns and complaints and pushed on into the forest. They crossed the familiar river and the trees that they had encountered in the past, each step becoming more and more familiar as they went. As they came to the now fallen bridge and chasm, they knew that they had come the right way, and after a few moments of arguing, they knew how to cross. Within seconds, the forest lit up. With another flash of bright light, the mares appeared on the other side of the chasm, no worse for wear. The three took a moment to catch their breath, as the old castle ruins came to view.
Look, girls, there it is. It looks like it hasn't changed since Grevin arrived.
Her speech was cut short by a faint scream that made her blood run cold. Rarity's eyes widened and she shivered.
That sounded like Sweetie Belle. We must hurry. Hold on, Sweetie. Big Sis is coming.
Rarity broke into a full gallop, forcing Applejack and Twilight to run after her, all three nervous as to what they might find once they reached the castle. Once they reached the ruins, things grew eerily silent. There was no sound of the insects of the forest, no sounds of the crusaders, just silence. Rarity looked back at her friends with worry.
Do you think they are...
The three jumped at the sound of a scream and quickly bolted into the large ruin, hoping to find the source before it was too late. Twilight narrowed her eyes as she realized where they would most likely find the three girls.
Girls, follow me. I think I know where to find them.
The three turned and ran up several sets of stairs, moving through various empty rooms until they came to the chamber that the two of them knew too well. As they entered, Twilight and Applejack both recognized the various rubble and stone pillars, as well as the pool of dried blood on the floor. However, what they saw next made their eyes narrow in fear and their blood run cold. Across the room, strung up by their front hooves on three pillars, were the crusaders. The three fillies were dirty and bruised and bloody. The rope used to hold them up, clearly digging into the flesh, causing crimson to flow down their legs. And they had various cuts across their chests. Each filly had tears in their eyes, sobbing quietly, even as they began to focus on the three mares that came into the room. However, this was not the only sight that greeted the three. Standing next to the three fillies was an imposing figure of a man. He wore black, spiked armor that seemed to be suited for purely offensive combat. His shoulders were broad, and had a dark cape draped across his back, ending just at his feet. He stood at 6 feet 4 inches tall and seemed to be quite strong. He had blonde hair and deceivingly handsome blue eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. He had no scars across his face, and would even seem quite angelic, if not for the manic grin on his lips. He had a large broadsword strapped to his back, and in his hands a bloody dagger. Slowly the man turned to face the three, a dark chuckle escaping him, the sound of his voice sending a chill down the ponies' backs.
Well, well, well. What do we have here? More company, yes? Perhaps you three can give me the answers I seek.
Twilight felt a lump form in her throat, as a magical energy seemed to fill the room, its energy pressuring her own, making it difficult to focus. Applejack and Rarity felt it too, the air becoming heavy as the man took a step forward.
Who are you?
He chuckled and twirled the blade in his fingertips a moment, as he paced back and forth in front of the fillies.
No, no, no. You don't ask questions. I do. You must learn the rules.
He quickly lashed out and ran the blade of his dagger against the flesh of Scootaloo, causing the filly to cry out in pain as a fresh, narrow cut appeared in her flesh, small drips of blood beginning to flow from it, just down her barrel to her legs. Rarity stepped forward.
Stop it now, you ruffian! Don't hurt them!
He twirled the blade once more as he moved the stand in front of Sweetie Belle.
Then follow my rules. It's quite simple. I ask a question, I get an answer. Then you ask a question, and maybe you get an answer. If I don't like your question, I hurt one of them. Or you ask a question out of turn, I hurt one of them. Lie to me, and I hurt one of them. Upset me enough, and one will die. Continue to upset me, and one of you will die. Are we clear?
The three mares hesitated, glancing at one another for a moment, until another cry of pain filled the room. This time it was Sweetie Belle. The man had dragged his blade down her side, leaving a thin but bloody cut in the dagger's wake.
I asked, are we clear?
Twilight quickly stepped forward.
Yes, we understand. Just please don't hurt them anymore.
He smiled and let his hands fall to his side, still holding the blade tightly in his black, gloved grip.
Good.
Now tell me, where am I?
You're in a place called Equestria, near a small town called Ponyville.
Good. That at least matches up with what they have told me so far. Now you get to ask a question.
Applejack frowned.
Just who are you?
And the man smirked and winked at the mare.
I like your accent. That's who I am. My name is Davick. Next question. Is there a man named Grevin here in this land called Equestria?
Rarity frowned.
I don't see what that has to do with anything. What do you want with him?
Davick's smirk turned into a scowl, and he quickly moved to Applebloom and ran a blade down her left hind leg, earning a cry of pain from the filly.
No, quiet! You asked a question instead of answering my question. Is he here, or isn't he?
Twilight took a slow, steadying breath as her two friends watched her.
He is. He has lived here for the past couple of months, though we don't know much about him.
Davick smirked.
Good girl. Thank you for answering that for me. However, since you decided to break my rules, I'm going to get to ask another question. How did I come to be in this place?
I don't know. Grevin simply appeared one day. Perhaps the same sort of thing happened to you?
Fair enough. Your turn, little creature.
Twilight said nothing for a moment, then looked over at the three fillies.
What will you do when you finish your questions?
His eyes narrowed as his grin grew sadistic once again.
Why, I'm going to kill all of you. How silly a question to ask. What a waste. My turn now.
Twilight narrowed her eyes and pawed the ground as the frustration grew. She needed to help the girls, but if she made a move too soon, he would kill at least one of them.
What manner of creatures are you? And do you have leaders?
Rarity nodded.
We are ponies. There are unicorns, earth ponies, and Pegasus ponies. As for our leaders, we are led by Princess Celestia and Princess Luna.
Davick rolled his eyes.
You sound like a prim and proper woman from my world. I like those kinds of women. I could make them scream in bed for hours. Before I would kill them, of course.
Rarity took a step back, a look of fear growing in her eyes. Twilight quickly moved in front of her friend.
My turn for a question. Why do you want to know about our leaders?
Davick chuckled.
Well, it should be obvious. I plan on overthrowing them. I need to know their names if I am to do so. Now, do you know where I can find Grevin now?
Applejack shook her head.
No, I haven't seen him lately.
She quickly darted her eyes to the left, then right, hoping he hadn't seen her bluff. Sadly, another cry of pain filled the room, as Scooterly received another long cut at the base of her wings.
Don't lie to me. Where is he?
Twilight shook her head, her voice cracking.
We honestly don't know. Please, let the fillies go.
Davick growled and raised his blade up to strike once more. If you won't tell me where he is, then one of them dies. Time seemed to slow down as the dagger glinted in the room's light, the blade beginning to arch downward towards its next target. Sweetie Belle. Rarity screamed and Applejack began to run forward, but it was too late. The blade pierced the filly in the chest and drove down into her barrel, blood spurting violently from the wound. Sweetie Belle's eyes snapped wide as her jaw dropped, a look of shock coming over her features. Her mouth seemed to move as though she was trying to say something, but nothing came out the other end, other than a faint whisper. Her eyes locked onto Rarity as a single tear fell down her cheek, and then to the ground, before she slumped over, her head hanging limp, her body no longer moving, just dangling by the ropes she was bound by. Rarity fell to her knees, crying out in pain as she watched her sister be murdered right before her eyes. Applejack quickly moved to her side, wrapping her in her hooves, holding her close.
You monster! She was a child! A filly! She was an innocent filly!
Davick simply smirked as he pulled the blade from Sweetie's corpse and winked at the 3 mares across the room. He slowly pulled the blade close and stuck out his tongue, running it over the bloodied end, tasting the crimson from his victim. She tastes pure, like she hadn't been around long enough to have any terrible experiences in life. He slowly moved the blade over the neck of Applebloom, causing Applejack to hold her breath. Perhaps I should do this next one. Maybe separate her neck, her head from her neck. That is, unless you tell me where I can find Grevin. Twilight raised a hoof to her eyes, brimming with tears.
Wait, all right. We know where you can most likely find him.
Applejack frowned, snapping her gaze up to her friend.
Twa, no. He'll kill us no matter what we tell him.
Davick smirked and twirled his blade once more. I may be willing to offer mercy. Tell me. Twilight looked down.
He's in the swamp. He lives there to keep distance from us pony folk.
Davick grinned, turning away from the mares, missing the shocked look on Applejack's face. Excellent. I'll have to pay him a visit. Thank you for telling me everything. I needed it. Now, should I let you live, or let you die? An answer never came, though, thanks to the sound of shattering glass blowing out in front of the right side of the room. Grevin's thoughts were running rampant as he sprinted to Sweet Apple Acres. He knew that there was something terribly wrong. He could feel it in his gut. His instincts told him that he needed to gear up, ready for battle with everything he had, but his heart told him he didn't have the time. He leapt over the gate to the farm and bolted up the dirt path, making a beeline for the barn. He quickly threw open the door and stashed up to the loft, his mind already trying to figure out what he would need to take with him. Once in the loft, he skidded to a halt and began to look over his belongings. He knew that he wouldn't need his cloak, and his armor would take too long to put on. He quickly reached down and took his gauntlets, sliding them on, and then reached for his 2 swords, strapping them to his back as fast as he could. He took a final glance over his shoulder before running back down the stairs and out the barn doors to the orchard, his mind going over what he had with him now. He had his 2 primary blades, 2 gauntlets to protect his forearms, and a single dagger hidden in one of those. He didn't have his armor nor his cloak, so he was very exposed and would be vulnerable. He knew, though, that that was worth the risk. He took a vow to keep the citizens of Equestria safe, and if that meant him being hurt,
so be it. Grevin quickly ran through the orchard, the path taking him past the all-too-familiar CMC clubhouse, and to the edge of the Everfree Forest. Inside that forest could be a simple castle ruin with 3 fillies lost inside it. Or possibly a dangerous creature that he would have to defeat. He had no idea what to expect, but he didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, leaping over brush and fallen sticks, moving deeper and deeper into the forest. As he ran, Grevin couldn't help but find it funny that he always seemed to be drawn back into this forest. He had entered it when he first came to Equestria, and even contemplated living in it. Now he was back again, running a somewhat familiar path. Perhaps it was fate. He didn't know, and honestly didn't care. After a half hour of running, Grevin finally came across the chasm that separated the castle ruins from the rest of the forest. He knew there was a small bridge here at one point, but didn't see one now. Something happened to it. He continued to look for it, his eyes darting from place to place, hoping to find anything he could use, and then he saw it. The remains of the bridge, dangling on the far side of the chasm. There was no way he could simply cross now. His head snapped to look in the direction of the scream that just echoed through the forest. It wasn't the cry of an animal falling prey to a predator. No, it was a pain-filled scream that made his blood run cold. It was the scream of a filly who was in danger, and he needed to help them. Glancing back over at the dangling bridge, he knew what he had to do. Grevin took a few steps back and hunkered down, taking slow, even breaths, and then he broke into a dead run, building up as much speed as he could. Faster and faster he pumped his legs, his weight lighter now that he wasn't wearing his armor, and as he reached the edge of the cliff, he pushed off into a mighty leap. For a moment he felt weightless, peaceful even, until he began to fall, and gravity took hold of him once again. He saw the bridge coming closer to him, and with all his effort, he reached out and took hold of one of the planks, slamming his entire mass against the opposite cliff face. The plank groaned and began to crack under his weight, but it held, and Grevin quickly took hold of the dangling ropes, and slowly began to pull himself up the cliff face. He had to hurry, lest one of the fillies be hurt further, or even killed. He growled and doubled his pace, ignoring the strain of his muscles. He needed to get to that castle. After climbing for 3 minutes, the man finally made it to the cliff edge, and without taking a moment to catch his breath, he broke into another run, his destination clear. Grevin had a feeling that he knew where to find the group, but he also knew that if there were an enemy, they would be expecting him to be coming through the main entryway. That wouldn't do. He needed to find another way in. He quickly circled around, and the cry of a mare drew his attention to a large set of windows not far from where he stood. It was Rarity, and something terrible had just happened. He felt his blood run cold, and his anger grow, as he quickly drew a blade from his back. He threw caution to the wind and began to climb a nearby tree, finding a sturdy enough branch to support his weight. He carefully lined himself up with the window, and once again steeled himself for battle. He took a slow, deep breath and lunged out from the branch, through the air, and crashed into the window, shattering it as he came through in a shower of glass. He quickly tucked into a roll and came up in a defensive stance, glancing around, trying to make sense of his surroundings as quickly as possible. He caught a glimpse of Twilight, Applejack, and Rarity behind him, over his shoulder, but what he saw before him nearly made him freeze in shock. There before him stood the same man from his nightmare, the man that made his life hell for the citizens of Bastion. Now he was here, and he had clearly been torturing those poor fillies, stringing them up like they were going to be slaughtered. His eyes focused on Sweetie Belle, specifically due to the amount of blood that coated her front, as well as her limp head, resting on her chest. He felt his blood run cold as he saw the slightest bit of movement from her chest, which seemed to force more blood out of her wounds.
His eyes snapped to the deranged killer before him, and he slowly rose to his feet, his teeth clenched, his grip tightening around his blade, a growl escaping his throat.
Davick.
Davick simply smirked and sheathed his dagger in a small hilt on his left side, then began to walk forward with arms spread out in a welcoming gesture.
Grevin, so good to see you. I thought perhaps your existence here was a simple myth. It's so nice to see a familiar face.
Grevin quickly reached out with his right arm, forcing Davick to stop just at the tip of his sword.
What are you doing here? What have you done to these fillies?
Davick grinned and began to walk around Grevin, keeping himself just in front of the blade's point, his heavy bootsteps the only sound piercing the air.
I don't know why I suddenly appeared here, and honestly, I don't know what I was doing before I showed up. However, the moment I arrived, I knew I'd done so for a single purpose. To rule this land as I see fit. When I first arrived, I was alone, but then came along these 3 little darling girls.
He nodded to the 3 crusaders strung up on the far side of the room.
I hid from them and listened into their conversation, and much to my surprise, your name escaped their lips. They were about to leave before I could learn more, and I just couldn't have that, so I invited them to stay as my guests.
He licked his lips and let his smirk grow.
They gave me so much information, most of it useless. Where they went to school, something about crusading for some nonsense. But eventually, they told me the name of this world and some of the nearby villages. They even talked about you and how you slew a dragon. My, you've been busy in your time here.
He continued to circle Grevin, much like a predator circling its prey.
I knew that if you were here, you would get in my way, and I can't have that. So, in order for me to kill off these princesses and assume proper control of the land, you need to die.
Grevin growled as he felt a surge of magical energy within him, his anger growing.
You so bent on your sick and twisted goals that you decided to hurt these poor fillies. You disgust me. I'll never allow you to complete your goals.
Davick slowly came to a stop, just in front of Applejack, Twilight, and Rarity, a simple smile adorning his lips.
Oh?
Within a second he reached back and had drawn the great sword from its holder on his back, and swung it out so the tip now pointed at the 3 mares, the heavy blade holding steady in the grip of his right hand. Meanwhile, his left hand redrew the dagger and held it on the opposite side, ready to deflect any blows Grevin may throw.
I don't see it that way.
Grevin growled and took a small step forward, only to have Davick step back and move closer to his friends.
Grevin. You come any closer, and I'll have to make sure to skewer at least 2 of your friends here.
Grevin slowly paused and took another stance. His eyes narrowed.
What do you want?
Davick chuckled softly.
Quite simple. I want you to take your blades and slit your throat. I want you to eliminate yourself in front of these women, girls, mares, whatever. If you eliminate yourself as a threat to me, I'll let them live.
Grevin blinked slowly, letting his gaze shift over to the terrified faces of the 3 mares, all of whom were staring back at him in horror. He knew that the elements of harmony could most likely trap Davick in stone, or even remove him from this world if need be. But if he did take his life, how could he guarantee the girl's safety?
How do I know you'll keep your word?
Twilight gasped and moved forward, reaching out a hoof to him.
Grevin, no!
Applejack winced, looking down.
Sugar Cube?
Davick glanced back at the mares before looking at Grevin once more.
You don't, but I'll give you my word from one warrior to another.
Grevin frowned and took a few steadying breaths as he let his eyes snap from Davick back to the mares. There was another possibility that came to his mind. If he took his own life, then the connection that the creature's discord pulled from his mind would be severed. That perhaps could remove them from Equestria. For several tense minutes, he slowly began to pull his blade back.
I've come to a decision.
A soft gasp filled the room, and a faint voice seemed to echo, drawing everyone's attention to the white unicorn filly that hung limply from the column. Sweetie Belle's eyes were barely open, and her chest barely moving out, as she weakly gasped for breath.
Grevin, don't.
She clenched her eyes shut, earning a cry of worry from her sister.
Sweetie Belle, hang on. We'll get you help.
Davick smirked as he rolled his eyes, turning his attention back to Grevin, who had let his arm drop to his side and allowed his head to hang down, hiding his eyes behind his hair.
Well, hero, will you save these ponies, or let them die? Perhaps you'll go back to your old ways and show me a true fight. Perhaps channel some of that old hatred of yours.
Grevin growled as he clenched his free hand at his side.
I think the choice is obvious.
Applejack gasped and shook her head.
No, don't!
Grevin quickly pulled back, raising his blade once more, and lunged for Davick with a quick jab, forcing the villain to jaunt to the side a few steps.
I'm just going to have to kill you, you son of a bitch!
Davick grinned and brought his large blade forward, taking a relaxed stance, letting the blade rest at his side.
Then come for me, hero. See what you get for facing a superior foe.
Grevin ran forward and slung his blade, a battle cry escaping him, only to have Davick quickly duck under the blade's path and move in under Grevin's guard. Grevin prepared for it, though, and quickly rolled to the side, dodging the blade aimed for his throat, his free hand reaching back and pulling his second blade from the holster. Davick quickly sidestepped away from Grevin's twisting his blade so it would act as a shield, while he put some distance between he and his foe.
You're still using those twigs you call weapons, Hades? How pathetic! Those are no match for a real blade.
Grevin smirked and shook his head as he shifted his feet, moving his blades in front of him, so one was horizontal and the other vertical.
You think a heavy weapon like that is going to be effective? You have no speed with that thing. How you hit anything amazes me.
Davick smirked as he began to move in a circle, hoping to flank his foe.
But all it takes is a single hit. With those little twigs of yours, you're more or less taking your enemies down with paper cuts.
Grevin rolled his eyes as he began to move in a circular pattern as well, matching Davick step for step.
How about you stop spouting off this pathetic banter and come at me already? Or are you afraid I'll kick your ass?
Davick narrowed his eyes and growled as he raised his weapon and moved forward for an upward strike. Grevin raised his blades in an X to catch the weapon, but at the last moment, Davick shifted his feet and slid, and did a sharp spin, using his momentum to swing his blade down into an upward arc that nearly took Grevin's arm had he not seen it coming, and moved back enough only to take the tip of the blade along the side, causing him to hiss in pain. He quickly pushed the pain to the back of his mind, and quickly shifted his feet once more, bringing the blade down on Davick from above, only to have it blocked, and that's when Grevin's training took over. He quickly shifted his feet and moved into a quick spin that brought his other blade down along Davick's side, the two metals clanging against one another, earning a grunt of pain from the villain. He continued to move the blade, using its momentum to knock the large broadsword aside, while he spun again and drove his heel into Davick's side, knocking him to the ground and forcing him to slide a few feet. Grevin didn't hesitate to push his advantage, and leapt into the air, raising his blades over his head, aiming to come down and drive the two blades into his opponent's back. However, he was too slow, and just as it began to come down, Davick turned and pulled his weapon, aiming it straight for Grevin's midsection. Grevin's eyes widened, and he simply gasped as he realized his mistake, knowing that he couldn't do anything about it. And seconds later, the sound of a sword piercing flesh rang out through the room, followed by a deathly silence. The sound of two blades falling to the floor with a clang was the only sound that followed as Grevin simply looked down at the blade tip buried in his stomach before looking back at Twilight, Applejack, and Rarity, his face stating how sorry he was. Within an instant, Davick sat up and pushed a blade through Grevin with all his might, and the tip of the broadsword burst from his back, sending a large splattering of blood through the air, causing it to strike the floor, walls, and even the mirrors behind him, who could only watch in horror. Grevin grunted and took a gasping breath as Davick moved to a standing position, their eyes locked now on one another. Davick gave a simple smirk as he twisted his weapon into Grevin's flesh, earning a cry of pain from his foe. Grevin grit his teeth even as blood flowed up his throat and began to drip from his mouth, and tried to speak, only for Davick to pull back and use his weapon to force Grevin to turn so his back was to the CMC.
Shh, don't say a word, Grevin. I can only imagine how much time you have left now. This isn't a paper cut, you know.
He jiggled the blade, causing Grevin to cry out in pain. Davick leaned in and whispered in Grevin's ear.
See, you never stood a chance. Now they're all going to die, just because you made me waste my time.
That was such a short fight.
Why didn't you use your true strength? Were you afraid that these pathetic creatures would think of you? Don't you know you're better than any of them?
Davick pulled back once more and placed his boot on Grevin's chest, using it as leverage as he pulled his blade from the man's now bloody torso. Grevin dropped to his knees, his entire form shaking. He struggled to stay in that position, blood pouring from the open wound in his torso.
No.
Davick ignored the man and turned to face Twilight and her friends once more as he sheathed the blade on his back once again.
You see, I was going to let you all live, but since you gave me such a terrible fight, I'm going to kill you.
He twirled the dagger in his hand once again.
Starting with the young ones first.
Applejack watched in terror as the psychopath turned and raised the blade, aiming for her sister. She knew that this was it, and her sister would soon join her parents, and she turned her head as tears began to fall from her face. She had failed to protect her loved ones, failed to protect Equestria, and now someone close to her was going to pay the price. She clenched her eyes shut as she heard the sound of the blade piercing through flesh, followed by the sickening sound of blood falling to the floor. However, she wasn't expecting what came next. Verity quickly gasped and moved to her hooves, pushing Applejack away, nearly knocking her over, forcing her to her hooves. Her attention now pulled to the sight across the room. While she expected to see her sister impaled by a sharp blade, what she saw instead filled her with hope and horror at the same time. Grevin had raised up his hand up in the path of the blade, and it was now fully embedded in his hand through his palm. He wrapped his fingers around the handle and held Davick's hand there as he slowly raised his head to stare up at the shocked warrior, an animalistic growl leaving his throat, nearly causing a chill to fill the room.
The fight's not over yet, asshole. You wanted the old me. You got him.
Applejack could only stare as she watched the red of Grevin's eyes flash, casting a faint red glow on the stone floor under him, his entire being filling with magical energy before he suddenly lunged forward while rising to his feet, using his momentum to drive his skull into Davick's chin, snapping his head back. He didn't stop there, however, and used his firm grip on Davick's hand and the blade to pull the man closer. only to pull back with his left hand and drive it into his nose, nearly breaking it with a resounding crack. Davick stumbled backward, pulling his weapon from Grevin's hand, his left hand moving to his nose to stop the blood running from his nostrils. Twilight gasped as she quickly channeled her magic into her horn, and quickly confirmed what she suspected when she caught a glimpse of Grevin's eyes. There was a dark magic swirling around him like a storm. She could feel it moving through the room like a raging tempest, but the only visible sign of it was the small waves of magical energy coming off of him, similar to how heat can be seen rising from a blacktop road. Something in Grevin had snapped. This was not the same man that they knew. This was something darker, much darker, and it scared her. Grevin slowly tilted his head from side to side, popping his neck as he stalked forward, completely ignoring his wounds.
What's the matter, Davick? Don't tell me a broken nose is going to slow you down. I'm not even warmed up yet.
His voice was heavier, grittier, almost evil, causing the mares in the room to take a small step back. Davick growled and reached back for his blade, only to have Grevin surge forward, running full steam into the warrior, tackling him with a massive force. Grevin quickly pinned the man and moved over him so his knees held his arms down, while he began to strike him again and again in the head, every strike drawing more and more blood from the man's face.
This is what you get when you fuck with my friends!
The sound of Grevin's fists meeting Davick's face filled the room as Applejack looked on in horror. This wasn't her friend. This was not the gentle giant she had grown to care for. She had never seen Grevin act so savagely, and it shook her to the core. Grevin! The sound of her voice made him pause mid-swing. His fist bloodied from not only his wound, but Davick's as well. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at the three mares, his red eyes showing the exact opposite of what they were used to. Gone was the peaceful, kind soul, and in his place was someone whose eyes showed no compassion, no mercy, just hatred and pure rage. Slowly he rose up off Davick's still prone form, and he reached down, grabbing him by the collar of his armor, lifting him with ease. He glanced at the bloody face of his foe, noticing his piercing blue eyes staring up at him, a sick little grin on his face. Davick slowly turned his head to the side and spat out a thick wad of blood before chuckling.
Now you are the Grevin I remember so well. It's good to see you again.
Grevin pulled Davick close and stared at the man's eyes for a few seconds before growling once more.
The feeling isn't mutual.
He then quickly spun and threw the man effortlessly across the room into some rubble with such force that several large chunks of stone blew out from the other side, a large plume of dust filling the air. Grevin slowly walked over to where his weapons were, picking them up as the groans from Davick reached his ears. He slowly sheathed one of the blades and held the other in a firm grip as he turned and slowly stalked over to where Davick now lay. Twilight gasped, knowing that what he intended to do, and reached out with a hoof towards her friend.
Grevin, stop! It's over, you can stop!
No!
Grevin didn't even look at her as he moved over the still coughing man and placed a firm boot on his back, holding him down with ease. He reached down, and before Davick could move, he pulled his arm straight back at an awkward angle, earning a grunt of pain as the arm nearly pulled from its socket. Grevin simply smirked as he raised his other leg and let his heavy boot hover over the elbow of his foe. Davick cried out in pain as Grevin drove his boot down against the elbow, forcing it to bend and then snap under the pressure, savagely breaking the man's arm. Grevin slowly stepped back, a sick, satisfied smile on his lips as Davick flipped over and quickly cradled his twisted arm against his chest.
Oops! Did that hurt? Maybe next time you won't hurt innocent little fillies.
Twilight held her hoof to her mouth as she watched Grevin slowly torture the man called Davick, and it nearly made her sick. She didn't know how Grevin was even able to do all this with his wounds. Perhaps his biology was truly so different that he could do such things, but she wasn't really certain. She also knew that this Grevin was nothing like the man she cared for. Her Grevin was afraid of going back to how he used to be, and she could see why, if this was how he truly was. She knew, though, that deep inside, her friend, the man she felt for, was still there, and she had to reach him before he did something terrible.
Grevin, stop it! It's over! The fillies are safe! We are safe!
Twilight glanced at Applejack, then to Grevin, and nodded as she followed her friend's lead.
Grevin, you can stop! It's over, please! You can stop now!
Grevin glanced back at the broken man under him, then back at the mares, his eyes shimmering slightly as he began to visibly shake, his mind beginning to clear of the fog it was in. Twilight could feel it too. The dark energy coming from him was fading, slowly at first, but more and more steadily. With some hesitance, he moved off the man and took him by the collar, dragging him away from his friends and the fillies to the window he had leapt through to get there moments before. He took a moment to stare at the man, contemplating killing him, but he knew he couldn't do it. Not in front of the girls. They didn't need to see it if they didn't have to. He grunted as he pulled the limp figure up and cried out as he threw him through the window, out to the forest below, turning back before he could hear him hit the ground. Grevin could feel his strength failing him with every step now. His time was growing short. He knew that the wounds he suffered were severe, but he also knew he wasn't finished yet. He glanced over at the three mares and gave a small, reassuring nod before he stumbled, catching himself on the pillar that now held Scootaloo. Twilight felt her blood run cold as she began to realize what he might do.
Grevin, you're not going to... Are you? It could kill you!
Applejack felt tears in her eyes as she saw his eyes close with a soft smile, and seconds later an intense blue glow began to form on his good hand. Before any of them could move forward, he had pulled a hidden dagger from his gauntlet, and not only cut the filly from the rope that held her, but begun to heal her wounds as he cradled her form against him. Within seconds the filly was healed and had opened her eyes, blinking a few moments as she processed everything that was happening. Staring up at Grevin with wide eyes, Scootaloo whispered a simple thank you and ran over to Twilight, wrapping her hooves around the mare in a fierce hug. Grevin simply smiled and moved over to the next, Applebloom, doing the same with her. Rarity couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had heard about this talent from Fluttershy, but what she had heard was nothing compared to what she was seeing. Every cut, scrape, and bruise on the fillies healed and disappeared within moments. But new cuts and wounds began to form on Grevin, appearing on his neck, arms, and undoubtedly his legs and back, forcing more blood to stain his shirt and pool on the floor. How he was still standing was beyond her. If it were a pony, they would be drained completely by this point. It was as though he was operating through sheer will, allowing nothing to get in his way. She could only watch in awe as Applebloom, now healed, ran to her sister, crying in fear, but clearly all right. Then she watched as he finally came to Sweetie Belle, and her heart stopped for a moment. Grevin only looked at the poor filly as tears came to his eyes. This was his fault, his responsibility. He knew that discord had pulled Davick from his mind, and because of that, Sweetie Belle was near death. He looked somberly over his shoulder at Rarity, who held a hoof to her lips, her eyes brimming with tears. He forced a small smile and weakly spoke, his voice sounding as gentle as it ever did, as he began to raise his hand up to the filly. No worries. Rarity gasped and shook her head.
Grevin, there has to be another way.
He simply shook his head, a peaceful little smirk on his lips, and began to focus on his task, as two simple words escaped him. Worth it. He placed his hand on the young filly, frowning as he felt a similar sensation as to the mare back in Canterlot. The wounds began to heal, but she remained limp and unmoving, her chest not moving, her heart not beating. He shook his head once more and steeled himself, knowing that this was the only thing he could do. There wouldn't be another death on his hands if he could help it. Damn the consequences. This filly was going to return to her family. His decision made, he began to push his magic further, just as he had in Canterlot before being pulled away. He opened his eyes, glancing over to see Twilight staring at him in silent awe. She could almost feel the magic pulling from deep inside him, almost as if he were transferring his very essence into the filly. He pushed harder, drawing as much strength as he could from deep within himself, and he began to feel his vision fade, a cry of pain beginning to escape his lips as he raised his head to the ceiling, his voice filling the room. Twilight could only stare in fascination as she watched something change within her friend. His magic shifted, no longer dark, or even gentle as it normally was, and instead it became pure and light. It was as though his very soul had changed, something that seemed impossible. The magical pressure that filled the room changed as well, and became light and gentle, like a warm blanket, comforting and peaceful. However, that paled from what she witnessed coming from his eyes and hands. Slowly, the blue aura of his magical energy began to shift, becoming paler and paler until it shifted into a dull white. She could even see it begin to emit from his eyes. As time continued to pass, the white began to grow brighter and brighter, until it lit the room as though the very sun was there. The mares and fillies had all had to turn their heads as the glow became too much for their eyes, lest they be blinded. Moments later, they heard a cry of pain, followed by a deep gasp and the sound of ropes being cut. Seconds later, the light winked out, leaving the room in semi-darkness and silence. The mares and fillies all turned to look across the room, and to their amazement, there stood Sweetie Belle, unharmed and alive, her wide eyes blinking at them until she locked eyes with her sister, and then she began to cry as she ran into her Rarity's arms.
Rarity! Sweetie Belle! Oh, Celestia, sweetie, thank goodness you're all right.
The two sisters held one another tightly, both crying tears of joy, thankful to be reunited. Applejack looked over at Apple Bloom and gave her a warm hug as well, before looking at Twilight, who had begun to move forward, away from the group. Twilight said nothing, as she came to a stop after a few steps. After a moment she began to shake and tremble as tears began to fall from her eyes. She turned to Applejack, despair showing on her face.
Twilight, what's wrong?
She motioned to the figure now lying limp on the floor, blood pooling around his unmoving form.
Applejack, we need to get Grevin to the hospital right now.
Rarity frowned and quickly rose to her hose, her fear returning once more.
Twilight, is he going to be all right? I don't know.
Davick groaned as he began to pull out of the unconsciousness, his thoughts fuzzy, his vision blurry. He could feel his blood running down from his neck to his face, his nose painfully swollen, his left arm filling him with waves and waves of pain. Slowly he rolled himself over onto his stomach and pushed himself to his hands and knees, taking a few moments to collect himself before shakily rising to his feet, doing his best not to cry out as his arm flopped uselessly against his side. He looked up at the castle ruins he was just forcibly removed from, and felt his anger swell in his chest. He would make that fool pay for what he did. Perhaps he would find this Ponyville and then locate his friends. Maybe he would flay them alive in front of the troublesome warrior. He pulled his right hand back to pull the large blade he carried from its holster, but as his fingers wrapped around the handle, a surge of magic hit him, freezing him in place. I don't think so. You've had your fun for today.
Who are you?
Within seconds, a pair of yellow eyes appeared before him, floating in place for a few moments before a form began to develop around them.
I am called Discord, and I am the reason you're here.
Davick narrowed his eyes as he watched a strange conglomeration of creatures fully appear and float in midair before him.
And why will you not let me continue my fight with Mr. Hades?
Discord smirked and pointed up at the castle, just as a bright light flashed through the windows, making the two squint at the glint.
That's why. Playtime is over. But don't worry, though. I intend to introduce you to some other playmates.
With a wave of his magic, with the wave of his hand, the magic holding Davick in place dissipated, allowing the man to rest his arm on his side.
Playmates? This is some sort of twisted little game to you.
Discord chuckled as he turned and began to float upside down.
Everything is a game to me. It's my nature.
Davick slowly shifted his position, tilting his head to the side.
All right, it's clear that you're in charge of this particular game. So what kind of playmates am I going to meet?
Discord pointed out towards a large ridge of mountains in the distance.
Just past those mountains you will find a whole army of friends, and they are so good at what they do that they can play pretty much any game you can imagine.
Davick smirked as he began to walk forward, Discord floating beside him.
Sounds like it could be fun. But answer me this. We'll be coming back, right?
Discord laughed.
Huh, of course. I have too much invested in this place to not return.
The main six had all gathered in Ponyville Hospital and stood to watch over their friend from an observational window, while in the next room, several doctors and nurses were fervently working on the man that now barely resembled Grevin Hades. Rarity, Twilight, and Applejack had managed to get Grevin back to Ponyville without too much trouble, and once they had entered the city limits, they found that not only were they being greeted by the remaining main six, and after hearing a call for help from Rainbow Dash, multiple ponies came out to help them carry the man to the hospital. A few unicorns even tried a few healing spells as they went, though they had little effect. The three fillies were taken by counselors and reunited with their families and caretakers, who knew they would need time to work through their most recent ordeal. Grevin was immediately ushered into the emergency surgery, and the only ones allowed back there were the main six. Twilight immediately wrote to the princesses and had yet to receive a response. It had been 30 minutes since they had arrived, and now all they could do was watch as the doctors worked. They all hung on to one another for support, while trying to deal with this difficult situation in their own ways. Pinkie Pie, being the optimist of the group, quickly began to talk about how he would be bounced back in no time, and she would need to throw a get-well-soon party for him. Rarity cried openly, stating that if Grevin had truly given his life up for her sister, that she would make certain to honor him daily and make sure Sweetie Belle cherished every waking moment. Applejack held her crying friend, trying to comfort her as she watched the doctor's work. Rainbow Dash paced nervously in the air, the waiting clearly going against her nature. Twilight teleported several books from our library, hoping to find an advanced healing spell that she could use, but was not having any success, and Fluttershy sat silently, watching Grevin with an eerie calmness about her. Rarity glanced at her cream-colored friend, and sniffed as a few tears dripped from her cheeks to the floor.
Fluttershy, you seem so calm. How can you be this calm? Aren't you worried about Grevin?
Fluttershy let her gaze wander to the scene of the doctors working to slow his bleeding wounds, some trying to find his veins in order to transfuse blood. She watched several unicorns begin to try and heal him with magic, with very limited success. Then she let her gaze shift once more to the heart monitor. There she could see a very slow, somewhat sporadic heartbeat on the screen. Grevin was in battle for his very life, and he would have her support through the whole ordeal. She glanced back at her friend, and gave a sad smile.
I am very worried, Rarity, but I know Grevin is strong. He'll make it. He has to.
She turned back and stared at the pale, unconscious man on the operating table inside.
He has to.